What if I told you that the deadliest war in American history wasn't fought against a foreign enemy, but between brothers, neighbors, and fellow citizens? What if the greatest threat to the United States didn't come from across the ocean, but from inside its own heart? This is the story of a nation divided, where loyalty to state clashed with loyalty to country, where freedom for some meant chains for others, and where the very idea of America was put on trial by fire and blood. Welcome to Mission America, the channel where we uncover the pivotal moments, battles, and decisions that shaped this nation. If you want history told with power, suspense, and truth, then subscribe now and join our mission. Because today, we begin a journey through the American Civil War, 1861-1865, brother against brother, the war to preserve the Union. In the early 1800s, America was a nation split not by oceans, but by its own ideals. To the north, booming factories, railroads, and immigration fueled growth. To the south, sprawling plantations and the backbreaking labor of enslaved people sustained a way of life built on cotton and wealth. But beneath this balance was a fire waiting to ignite. Every new state that joined the Union brought the same burning question: would it allow slavery, or would it stand free? The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. These weren't just political debates. They were pressure valves delaying the inevitable explosion. And then came one man with a vision and a rifle. In October 1859, John Brown, a fiery abolitionist, stormed the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. His goal? To spark a slave uprising that would rip the chains of bondage from millions. The raid failed. Brown was captured, but when he was hanged, he didn't die alone. He left behind a prophecy that the sins of slavery would only be washed away in blood. The South saw Brown as proof the North wanted to destroy their way of life. The North saw him as a martyr to freedom. The nation shuddered, knowing his words were more than just the ravings of a radical. They were a glimpse of what was coming. Fast forward to 1860. The country goes to the polls. On the ballot, Abraham Lincoln, a little-known lawyer from Illinois who vowed to stop the spread of slavery. He didn't campaign in the South. He didn't even appear on the ballot in some states. Yet he won. For millions in the South, Lincoln's victory wasn't just politics. It was an existential threat. If the federal government could tell them slavery couldn't expand, what would stop it from taking slavery away altogether? So one by one, southern states began to leave. South Carolina first, then Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. Like dominoes falling, they walked out of the Union, declaring themselves a new nation, the Confederate States of America. And suddenly, the United States was no longer united. Imagine it. You're a farmer in Kentucky, and your brother across the river in Tennessee now belongs to a different country. You've sworn the same flag all your life, but overnight, half your nation tears that flag apart. What would you do? Would you fight for your state or for your country? For your brother or against him? This was the impossible choice millions of Americans faced in 1861. And it would ignite the bloodiest conflict this nation had ever seen. As the South built their new nation, Abraham Lincoln took the oath of office as president of a broken union. His message was clear. He would not invade. He would not strike first, but he would preserve the Union, no matter the cost. The South believed Lincoln would never fight back. They were wrong. All it would take was a single spark. In Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, a lonely Union garrison sat surrounded by Confederate forces. The men inside Fort Sumter were running out of supplies. Lincoln faced a choice: resupply the fort and risk war, or abandon it and admit defeat before the first shot was ever fired. He chose to send supplies, not weapons, not reinforcements, just food. But the Confederates refused to let that ship arrive. They saw Lincoln's move as defiance, an insult to their independence. And so, in April 1861, cannons were aimed at Fort Sumter. The fuse was lit. The question was no longer if America would fight, but when the first shot would be fired. When that cannon roared in Charleston Harbor, it wouldn't just shatter brick and stone. It would tear a nation apart. Brother would turn against brother. Families would divide. And more than 600,000 lives would be lost before the Union was preserved. This is where the American Civil War truly begins. Before we march deeper into history, make sure you hit that subscribe button and join us here on Mission America, where the past comes alive and the story of a nation is told through the eyes of those who lived it. Because the Civil War was more than battles. It was a test of America's very soul. And that test is only just beginning. The election of 1860 didn't just choose a president, it shattered a nation. Abraham Lincoln, the tall lawyer from Illinois with a gift for words, entered the White House to find the Union crumbling around him. South Carolina had already declared independence. 6 other states soon followed, claiming they were no longer bound by the Constitution. But was secession even legal? Could a state simply walk away from the United States of America? That question had no clear answer. And while Washington argued, the South acted. In February 1861, delegates from the seceded states gathered in Montgomery, Alabama. The air crackled with ambition. These men weren't rebels in their own eyes. They were revolutionaries, the Founding Fathers reborn. They drafted a constitution that mirrored America's, but with one glaring difference. Slavery was permanently protected. Then they chose their leader, Jefferson Davis, a Mississippi senator and former U.S. Secretary of War. Calm, proud, and fiercely loyal to the Southern cause, Davis became president of the Confederate States of America. To many Southerners, this was a moment of triumph. They believed they were defending liberty, states' rights, and a way of life rooted in cotton and bondage. But in the North, the mood was one of disbelief and anger. How could states simply dissolve the Union? To Abraham Lincoln, the answer was clear. They couldn't. On March 4, 1861, Abraham Lincoln stood on the steps of the Capitol, his tall frame visible above a sea of anxious faces. With threats of assassination swirling, soldiers and sharpshooters lined the rooftops. Lincoln's words were steady, but filled with urgency. "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies." He pleaded with the South to stay, promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed, but warned he would defend the Union at all costs. His closing line echoed across history. "The mystic chords of memory will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." But those angels were drowned out by drums of war. The split was no longer just political, it was cultural, economic, and personal. The North had factories, railroads, telegraphs, and nearly 22 million people. The South had vast farmlands, cotton wealth, and just 9 million people, nearly 4 million of them enslaved. On paper, the Union's strength seemed overwhelming. But the Confederacy had advantages too: experienced generals fighting on familiar ground and a cause they believed worth dying for. And most importantly, the South didn't need to conquer the North. They only had to survive long enough to convince the Union it wasn't worth the fight. Imagine being alive in 1861. You pick up a newspaper in New York. It declares the Union must be preserved at all costs. You turn to a paper in Charleston. It shouts that the South is fighting for its very survival. Who would you believe? Which side would you choose? This wasn't just politics. This was family. This was blood. Brothers stood on opposite sides. Fathers and sons marched under different flags. The United States had become two nations, bound by history, divided by principle, and hurtling toward war. Before the cannons roared, there were final attempts at compromise. Leaders in Washington scrambled to find common ground, proposing new amendments to protect slavery forever if it meant keeping the South. But it was too late. Distrust ran too deep. Every concession looked like surrender. Every pause looked like weakness. The South wanted independence. The North wanted unity. Neither would yield. By April 1861, the Confederate flag flew over courthouses, state capitals, and military posts across the South. Only one question remained: would the Union let them go? Or would it fight to bring them back? In Charleston Harbor, the answer was about to come, because inside the brick walls of a lonely fort called Sumter, the first shots of the Civil War were ready to be fired. And when those guns opened fire, America would never be the same. April 1861. Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. A lonely fort sits in the water, its stone walls battered by the tide. Inside, a handful of weary Union soldiers huddle together, cut off from supplies, cut off from reinforcements. Their commander, Major Robert Anderson, waits for word from Washington, but time has run out. The Confederate government has made its decision. They demand the fort surrender, and if Anderson refuses, they will fire. The United States of America is about to collapse into war. For months, tension had built around Fort Sumter. Lincoln had inherited the crisis from the previous president, James Buchanan, who had left the fort under siege but taken no action. When Lincoln announced he would send only food, not weapons or troops, to resupply the garrison, the Confederates saw it as an insult, a challenge to their authority. On April 11th, Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard sent a message to Major Anderson, surrender or face attack. Anderson, loyal to his oath, refused. In the early hours of April 12, 1861, as the sky darkened over Charleston, Confederate guns opened fire. Shells arced through the night sky. Explosions shook the harbor. For 34 straight hours, cannon after cannon thundered against Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun. Major Anderson and his men, just 85 soldiers, scrambled to return fire. Their cannons roared back, but their powder was limited. The fort's barracks caught fire, smoke choking the men inside. Yet, incredibly, not a single soldier died during the bombardment. The only casualties would come later. One Union soldier killed when a cannon misfired during the surrender ceremony, but the lack of bloodshed didn't matter. Symbolically, the damage was done. Fort Sumter had fallen. The American Union had been broken by Confederate cannon fire. When news spread, the reaction was immediate. In the North, outrage exploded. Lincoln issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. Crowds filled the streets. Men rushed to enlist. Bands played patriotic tunes as young recruits marched off to war. In the South, the fall of Fort Sumter was celebrated as a glorious victory. Bells rang, cannons fired in triumph, and more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, joined the Confederacy. The Union now faced not just 7 seceded states, but 11. This wasn't just a war between regions, it was a war between families. In Virginia, a young officer named Robert E. Lee was offered command of the Union Army. He turned it down, declaring he could not raise his sword against his native state. Soon, Lee would become the Confederacy's greatest general. Across the nation, brothers enlisted in different armies. One wore blue, another wore gray. Families were split, never to be whole again. The United States of America had truly become brother against brother. The North believed the conflict would be over quickly. One good battle, many said, and the South will surrender. Volunteers signed up with confidence, joking that they'd be home by Christmas. Young men paraded through the streets of Washington in brand new uniforms, carrying muskets they barely knew how to fire. But war would not be so simple. The South was just as determined. Farmers left their fields, lawyers left their offices, and planters left their plantations to defend what they believed was their independence. The Confederacy's spirit was fierce. They would not back down easily. Imagine being in Washington that spring. The air buzzes with energy, drums beating, flags waving, recruiters shouting for volunteers. You see your neighbors march away smiling, certain they'll be back in a few weeks. But what if you knew the truth? What if you could tell them this war would last 4 long years, that over 600,000 would never return? Would you warn them, or would you let them march off, innocent of the storm that lay ahead? The fall of Fort Sumter lit the fuse, but the explosion was only just beginning. Now, the Union and the Confederacy would raise massive armies, training raw recruits to march into battlefields drenched in blood. The North believed its numbers and industry would guarantee victory. The South believed its courage and cause would carry the day. And soon, on the rolling hills of Virginia, they would clash for the first time. The illusion of a quick war would be shattered at a place called Bull Run. The cannons at Fort Sumter had spoken. The war was no longer a possibility, it was reality. Now both the Union and the Confederacy had to do something they had never done before: build armies big enough to fight a modern war. In Washington, President Lincoln wasted no time. He called for 75,000 volunteers to serve for 90 days. 90 days. That's how short everyone thought the war would last. But as enlistment offices opened, the response was overwhelming. Farmers, shopkeepers, factory workers, and students lined up. Bands played patriotic songs, flags waved in every town square, and mothers wept as their sons kissed them goodbye. By summer, the Union had more men volunteering than it could equip. In the South, the spirit was just as fierce. Jefferson Davis called for volunteers, and men poured in by the tens of thousands. They believed they were defending their homes, their families, and their way of life. Unlike the North, the Confederacy had fewer factories, fewer railroads, and fewer weapons. But what they lacked in industry, they made up for in passion. Many Southerners believed one rebel soldier was worth 10 Yankees. The Union and Confederate armies could not have been more different. The Union Army had the numbers. Nearly 2.1 million men would serve in blue by the end of the war. It had the factories to make rifles, cannons, uniforms, and the trains to move them. But early on, it suffered from poor leadership and inexperience. The Confederate Army was smaller. Around 1 million men total would fight in gray. They lacked supplies, weapons, and often even shoes. But they had some of the best generals in history, men like Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and J.E.B. Stuart. It was a classic matchup, resources versus resilience, industry versus intensity. The young men who answered the call weren't soldiers yet. They were farm boys, clerks, and apprentices who barely knew how to hold a musket. Camps sprang up across both North and South. Tents lined muddy fields. Drill masters barked orders, and awkward recruits stumbled through their first marches. Some trained with real rifles, others with wooden sticks. Uniforms were mismatched, supplies scarce. Disease spread quickly in cramped, unsanitary camps. In fact, more soldiers would die from disease during the war than from bullets. But the spirit was strong. Both sides believed they would march off, fight one big battle, and return home victorious. In Washington, politicians and civilians were so confident that some even planned to picnic on the battlefield. They imagined watching the Union Army sweep the rebels aside in a grand spectacle. In Richmond, Confederates believed the Yankees were soft, unprepared for real fighting. They thought one hard punch would force Lincoln to let the South go free. Both sides were dangerously wrong. Close your eyes and picture it. You're a 19-year-old farmer from Pennsylvania. Yesterday, you were plowing your father's field. Today, you wear a blue uniform, a musket in your hands, and a heavy pack on your back. Across the lines, a 20-year-old blacksmith from Georgia marches in gray. He's never left his county before. Now he's marching toward Washington, certain he's fighting for honor and independence. Neither of you knows it yet, but you may meet on the same battlefield, and only one of you will return home. For Abraham Lincoln, finding the right generals would be one of the greatest struggles of the war. Early commanders were cautious, hesitant, and often unwilling to take risks. The Confederacy, on the other hand, gained an early edge. Many of America's most talented officers resigned their commissions to join the South. Men like Robert E. Lee, who turned down command of the Union Army, now stood ready to defend Virginia. Leadership would prove just as important as numbers, and the Confederates had it in spades. By July 1861, the first great clash was inevitable. Union troops gathered near Washington, eager to march south and crush the rebellion. Confederate troops prepared to defend their territory with equal determination. The two armies, both untested, both inexperienced, would collide near a small Virginia creek called Bull Run. What began as a march filled with songs, laughter, and flags would end in chaos, blood, and a shocking lesson. This war would not be short. This war would not be easy. The crowds who expected a quick victory would soon learn the terrible truth. At Bull Run, America would witness its first taste of the slaughter to come. And amid the smoke and confusion, a new Confederate hero would rise, earning a name that would echo through history: Stonewall Jackson. The summer of 1861 was full of confidence. In Washington, Union soldiers marched off to battle with cheers ringing in their ears. They believed one hard push would crush the rebellion. But on the rolling hills of Virginia, near a quiet little stream called Bull Run, those illusions would be shattered forever. Union General Irvin McDowell led about 35,000 troops out of Washington, aiming to strike a quick blow against the Confederates. His soldiers were raw volunteers, many carrying picnic baskets packed by their families, convinced this was just a summer adventure. Meanwhile, Confederate forces under General P.G.T. Beauregard gathered near Manassas Junction. They were smaller in number, but reinforcements under General Joseph Johnston rushed by train, the first major use of railroads in warfare. As the armies closed in, spectators from Washington, congressmen, journalists, even families followed, hoping to watch a grand Union victory like it was a parade. They would soon regret it. On July 21, 1861, the Union attacked. McDowell's men crossed Bull Run Creek, striking at Confederate positions. At first, the Union gained ground, pushing the rebels back. Excitement rippled through the crowd of onlookers. Victory seemed certain. But then, something happened that would change the course of the day and the war's reputation. On Henry House Hill, a Virginian brigade held its ground under relentless Union attack. Their leader, General Thomas Jonathan Jackson, sat calmly on his horse, refusing to yield. A fellow officer pointed and shouted, "Look, there stands Jackson like a stone wall." The name stuck. From that moment on, he would be known as Stonewall Jackson. Inspired by his example, Confederate troops rallied. Fresh reinforcements poured in. The Union advance faltered. As the day wore on, Union soldiers grew exhausted. Their lines broke under Confederate counterattacks. Panic spread. Men threw down their rifles, fled the field, and stumbled back toward Washington. The picnickers who had come to watch a spectacle were caught in the stampede, their carriages clogging the roads as frightened soldiers ran for their lives. The dream of a short war had ended in a nightmare of chaos. The Union defeat at Bull Run shocked the North. The newspapers howled with anger and disbelief. How could the mighty Union Army be humiliated so quickly? In the South, the victory fueled confidence. Many Confederates believed independence was now guaranteed. If they could win at Bull Run, surely they could win the whole war. But beneath the cheers, there was a grim reality. Both sides had suffered thousands of casualties, and both sides realized the truth. This would not be a 90-day war. This would be a long, bloody struggle. Picture yourself on that battlefield. Smoke thick in the air, the deafening roar of cannons all around. You look across the hill and see men charging, flags waving, bayonets glinting in the sun. Would you stand your ground like Stonewall Jackson? Or would you break and run with the others, your heart pounding with fear? At Bull Run, thousands of Americans faced that choice. Many never came home. Bull Run was more than just a battle. It was a revelation. The North learned it could not simply march into the South and win. The South learned victory would demand sacrifice, not just bravery. The war would require massive armies, new strategies, and a willingness to endure years of hardship. And as the dust settled, both sides began to prepare for the next round. The first clash at Bull Run was only the beginning. Now the Union would reorganize. Calling new generals to lead, the Confederacy would build on its momentum, believing it could outfight the North. In the East, a new Union commander, George B. McClellan, would rise, building a grand army to match the challenge. Facing him was the Confederacy's growing star, Robert E. Lee. The stage was set for a brutal contest in the fields and forests of Virginia. The defeat at Bull Run left Washington in shock. The Union had been humiliated, its army shattered, its pride bruised. If the Union was to win, it needed a new leader, someone who could turn a mob of volunteers into a professional fighting force. That man was George B. McClellan. McClellan was young, ambitious, and confident. After early success in Western Virginia, Lincoln placed him in charge of the Army of the Potomac, the Union's largest and most important force. The soldiers loved him. He drilled them, organized them, gave them discipline and pride. Under McClellan, the Union Army transformed from a ragtag collection of recruits into a polished, mighty force, nearly 100,000 men strong. The press called him the Young Napoleon. His troops adored him, chanting his name as he rode past on horseback. But McClellan had one fatal flaw: hesitation. McClellan believed the Confederates outnumbered him at every turn, even when Union intelligence showed otherwise. He delayed, planned endlessly, and hesitated to strike. Lincoln grew frustrated. "If General McClellan does not want to use the army," he quipped, "I should like to borrow it for a time." Still, McClellan pressed forward with his grand idea: the Peninsula Campaign. In spring 1862, McClellan launched a bold move. Instead of marching directly south, he transported his army by ship to Virginia's peninsula, aiming to strike at Richmond, the Confederate capital. It was a brilliant plan on paper. If Richmond fell, the Confederacy's heart would be exposed, but the campaign quickly bogged down. Confederate forces, though smaller, built strong defenses. McClellan's cautious nature meant he advanced slowly, giving the South time to prepare. And soon, the Confederacy would unleash its greatest weapon, Robert E. Lee. At first, Lee wasn't popular. Many thought him too cautious, too willing to build fortifications rather than attack. But when Confederate General Joseph Johnston was wounded, Lee was given command of the Army of Northern Virginia. Everything changed. Lee was daring, aggressive, and bold. He believed in taking risks and keeping his opponents off balance. His leadership electrified the Confederate Army. Soldiers trusted him, and soon he would become a legend. In June 1862, Lee struck back. For 7 brutal days outside Richmond, he launched wave after wave of attacks against McClellan's larger army. The fighting was chaotic, bloody, and relentless. While the Union held its ground in many places, McClellan lost his nerve. Convinced he was outnumbered, he retreated. Lee had saved Richmond. The Confederacy had turned back the Union's greatest threat. The cost was staggering. Tens of thousands dead or wounded. But Lee had proven himself, and his army's confidence soared. Lee wasn't finished. That summer, he marched north, clashing once again with Union forces in Virginia. At the Second Battle of Bull Run, Confederate General Stonewall Jackson executed a daring maneuver, striking the Union from behind. Union forces under General John Pope were crushed. Once again, Northern hopes were dashed. The road was open. For the first time, the Confederacy would carry the war into the North. Imagine standing in Washington that summer, only a year earlier. People believed the war would end quickly. Now Union armies were reeling, morale was low, and Confederate victories seemed unstoppable. What if the South could win one great victory on Northern soil? Would foreign nations like Britain or France step in and recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate country? The stakes had never been higher. Robert E. Lee had proven himself a master of bold strategy. George McClellan had proven himself cautious, hesitant, unable to seize the moment. Now Lee would march north into Maryland, hoping to deliver a decisive blow. The Union would scramble to respond. And in a quiet valley along a river called Antietam, America would witness the bloodiest single day in its history. While Robert E. Lee fought his battles in Virginia, the war in the Western Theater, the vast region of Tennessee, Kentucky, and the Mississippi River would prove just as crucial. Here, the Union found its unlikely hero, Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was no polished Napoleon. Before the war, he had struggled in business, even failed at farming. At one point, he was working in his father's leather goods store. Many saw him as a man of wasted potential. But when war came, Grant returned to the army, and there he discovered his true calling. Unlike many generals, Grant was not paralyzed by hesitation. He was decisive, relentless, and utterly determined to win. The West was dominated by rivers: the Ohio, the Tennessee, the Mississippi. Control the waterways, and you controlled supply lines, trade, and the movement of armies. Grant's first big test came in early 1862 with the assault on Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, 2 Confederate strongholds guarding the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. With the help of Union gunboats, Grant attacked. Fort Henry fell quickly. At Fort Donelson, the Confederates fought fiercely, but Grant refused to back down. When asked what terms he would offer for surrender, Grant replied with words that would define his legend. No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. From that day forward, he was known as Unconditional Surrender Grant. The North cheered. For the first time, the Union had a general who delivered victories. Flush with success, Grant pushed deeper into Tennessee. But in April 1862, at a quiet riverside town called Shiloh, he would face his deadliest trial yet. At dawn, Confederate forces under Generals Albert Sidney Johnston and P.G.T. Beauregard launched a surprise attack on Grant's camp. Union soldiers were caught unprepared. Chaos erupted. Men fled in panic. The battle seemed lost, but Grant stood firm. He rallied his troops, refused to retreat, and held the line until reinforcements arrived. The fighting at Shiloh was savage. Bayonet charges, hand-to-hand combat, artillery tearing men apart. By the time it was over, more than 23,000 soldiers were dead or wounded. The North was shocked. They had expected glorious victories. Instead, Shiloh revealed the true face of war: brutal, bloody, and merciless. But despite the carnage, the Union had held the field. Grant had survived his trial by fire. After Shiloh, critics accused Grant of carelessness, even demanded his removal. But President Lincoln defended him. "I can't spare this man," Lincoln said. "He fights." And that, above all else, was what the Union needed. Beyond Tennessee, another great prize awaited: the Mississippi River. For the Confederacy, the Mississippi was a lifeline, connecting the western states of Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas to the rest of the South. For the Union, capturing it would split the Confederacy in two. Grant now set his sights on the fortress city of Vicksburg, perched high on bluffs overlooking the river. But taking it would not be easy. The campaign would demand ingenuity, endurance, and a relentless drive, qualities Grant had in abundance. Picture this: on the fields of Shiloh, men who had never seen war now lay dead in heaps. Families in the North opened their newspapers in horror at casualty lists that seemed endless. For the first time, Americans began to realize the Civil War would not be short. It would not be clean. It would consume everything. And yet, amid the despair, one name kept appearing in the headlines: Ulysses S. Grant. Would this unlikely general, once a failed farmer, become the man to turn the tide of the entire war? While Grant carved his legend in the West, another revolution was happening at sea. The Union Navy was strangling the South with a blockade, cutting off supplies, choking its economy. And on the waters of Hampton Roads, two strange-looking vessels would clash in a battle that would change naval warfare forever. While armies clashed on bloody fields across the American countryside, another war raged quietly but decisively: the war at sea. This struggle would determine whether the Confederacy could survive as a nation or be strangled into submission. From the very beginning, President Abraham Lincoln understood the power of the Union Navy. He announced a blockade of the Confederate coastline, stretching nearly 3,500 miles from Virginia to Texas. This became known as the Anaconda Plan, a slow, crushing strategy designed to squeeze the life out of the South. Just like an anaconda snake, the Union Navy would coil around the Confederacy, cutting off trade, supplies, and foreign aid. At first, the blockade was porous. The South relied on daring blockade runners, fast, sleek ships that slipped through at night, carrying weapons and supplies from Britain and the Caribbean. But as the war dragged on, the Union's naval might grew. Dozens of ships became hundreds, and the blockade grew tighter and tighter. The South's economy began to suffocate. Cotton exports plummeted. Weapons and food grew scarce. The seas were becoming a Union stronghold, but the war at sea was about to change forever. In early 1862, the Confederates unveiled a terrifying new weapon, an ironclad warship. They took the burned remains of a Union ship, the USS Merrimac, and rebuilt it with sloping iron plates. It was renamed the CSS Virginia. Unlike the old wooden ships, cannonballs bounced off its armor like pebbles off stone. When the Virginia steamed into Hampton Roads, Virginia, it unleashed destruction. Union wooden ships were no match. The Virginia sank or burned several vessels in a single day. Panic spread. Was the Union Navy doomed? The answer came the next morning. On March 9, 1862, the world witnessed one of the most famous naval battles in history. The Union had rushed its own ironclad into service, the USS Monitor. It was a strange, almost comical-looking ship, flat, small, with a single rotating gun turret that looked like a giant tin can. When the Monitor met the Virginia in battle, the world held its breath. Cannon roared, iron plates rang with the impact of shells, smoke billowed across the water. For hours, the two iron giants pounded each other at point-blank range. But unlike the wooden ships that burned so easily, neither vessel could destroy the other. It was a stalemate. And yet, the battle changed everything. Wooden navies were obsolete. The age of iron and steam had begun. Even as the ironclads stunned the world, the larger Union strategy of blockade tightened. Confederate ports like New Orleans fell to Union forces. Control of the Mississippi River became a central goal. As the Union sought to split the South in two, the Navy also supported river campaigns, ferrying troops, bombarding forts, and choking off Confederate strongholds. The Confederacy, with limited shipbuilding capacity, could never match the North's industrial might. Imagine being a Southern merchant in 1863. Your warehouses are full of cotton, but you cannot sell it. Your ships sit idle, trapped by Union gunboats. Families in the South begin to feel the pinch. Less food, fewer supplies, higher prices. The blockade wasn't just a military tactic, it was economic warfare. Could the Confederacy hold out long enough for foreign powers like Britain or France to intervene? Or would the Union's grip slowly choke it to death? The war at sea was reshaping technology, strategy, and even the world's navies. But on land, the struggle was about to reach a fever pitch. In September 1862, Robert E. Lee would carry the war into Union territory, gambling everything on one daring campaign. On the banks of a quiet river in Maryland, America would face its bloodiest single day. September 1862. For the first time, the war crossed into northern soil. Robert E. Lee, bold as ever, marched his Confederate army into Maryland. His plan? To strike a decisive victory on Union ground, demoralize the North, and perhaps convince Britain or France to recognize the Confederacy as an independent nation. But what unfolded along a winding river called the Antietam Creek would become the bloodiest single day in American history. Lee believed the Union was weary. The North had endured defeat after defeat in Virginia, and morale was collapsing. If he could deliver a crushing blow in Maryland, perhaps the Union would sue for peace. But Lee's army was tired, hungry, and outnumbered. Many of his men marched barefoot, their uniforms ragged. Still, their faith in Lee's daring leadership carried them forward. What Lee didn't know was that fate would play a strange hand. As Lee advanced, a Union soldier stumbled upon a package in a field, 3 cigars wrapped in a piece of paper. That paper was none other than Lee's battle plan, Special Order 191. The orders revealed Lee's exact movements. When the document reached Union General George McClellan, he had in his hands an unparalleled advantage. Excited, McClellan boasted, "Here is a paper with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home." But true to his nature, McClellan delayed. Even with Lee's secrets in hand, McClellan hesitated, giving the Confederates time to regroup. Still, battle was inevitable. September 17th, 1862. At dawn, Union forces surged forward near a small, whitewashed building known as the Dunker Church. The fighting began in a cornfield, stalks towering above the soldiers. For hours, Union and Confederate troops poured volleys of musket fire into each other at point-blank range. The cornfield was mowed down not by harvesters, but by bullets. Men fell in such numbers that survivors said you could walk across the field without touching the ground, only the bodies beneath your feet. By midday, Union forces struck at a sunken dirt road that Confederate soldiers had turned into a defensive trench. Wave after wave of Union soldiers charged. Confederate muskets tore them apart, but eventually the Union broke through. The road was piled with Confederate dead, so many that it became known forever as Bloody Lane. Still, McClellan hesitated to exploit the breakthrough. Lee's battered army held on. On the Union left flank, General Ambrose Burnside faced another obstacle, a narrow stone bridge spanning Antietam Creek. Confederates on the high ground poured fire onto the bridge, mowing down Union troops who tried to cross. For hours, the slaughter continued. Finally, Union forces broke through, but too late. Confederate reinforcements under Stonewall Jackson arrived just in time to stabilize the lines. When night fell, the battlefield was a vision of hell. More than 23,000 men were dead, wounded, or missing. The cornfield was a charnel ground. The Bloody Lane was filled with corpses stacked 3 deep. The creek at Burnside's bridge ran red. It was the bloodiest single day in American history, and yet, neither side could claim true victory. Lee retreated back into Virginia, his invasion thwarted. McClellan had the chance to destroy the Confederate army but failed to pursue. Though tactically inconclusive, Antietam was a strategic victory for the Union. For the first time, Lee's advance had been stopped, and Abraham Lincoln saw his chance. Just days later, he issued one of the most important documents in American history, the Emancipation Proclamation. The war was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was now a fight to end slavery. Picture the battlefield at night, the smoke still hanging in the air, lanterns flickering as soldiers search for the wounded. The cries of dying men echo through the fields. Was it worth it? Could any cause justify this much suffering? And yet, out of this sea of blood came a new purpose. The Union now carried not only the banner of unity, but of freedom. Antietam was a turning point. The Union had stopped Lee's advance. But the true revolution came days later, when Abraham Lincoln transformed the very meaning of the war. Soon, the conflict would not only decide the fate of the Union, but the fate of millions enslaved in the South. September 1862. The fields of Antietam still reeked of smoke and blood. The Union had fought Lee to a standstill. It wasn't a perfect victory, but it was enough. Enough for President Abraham Lincoln to take the boldest step of his presidency, a step that would change the very purpose of the war. From the very beginning, Lincoln's main goal had been simple: preserve the Union. Slavery was a poisonous issue. If he moved too quickly against it, he risked pushing border states like Kentucky and Missouri into the Confederacy. Moved too slowly, and he risked alienating abolitionists and losing the moral heart of the fight. Lincoln walked a tightrope, but as the war dragged on, he realized something undeniable. Slavery was the foundation of the Confederacy's strength. Enslaved labor built forts, worked fields, and kept the Southern economy alive. Destroy slavery, and you cripple the rebellion. The time had come. On September 22, 1862, just days after Antietam, Lincoln announced the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that unless the rebellious states returned to the Union by January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in those states would be forever free. The Confederacy scoffed. They would not return. And so, Lincoln prepared to make good on his word. On January 1, 1863, in the White House, Lincoln took up his pen. His hand trembled, not from doubt, but from exhaustion. Hours of shaking hands at the New Year's Day reception had left him weary. He paused, then steadied himself. He signed his name. With that stroke of ink, the Emancipation Proclamation became law. It declared freedom for enslaved people in all states still in rebellion. While it did not immediately free every slave, especially in Union-held areas, it transformed the war. No longer was it just about preserving the Union. It was about freedom. The reaction was explosive. In the North, abolitionists rejoiced. For the first time, the Union was officially fighting to end slavery. Enslaved people in the South heard whispers of the proclamation and began fleeing to Union lines in greater numbers. Thousands risked everything for a chance at freedom. In the Confederacy, fury burned. They vowed never to accept a Union that sought to destroy their way of life. The proclamation hardened their resolve. Abroad, the effect was just as critical. Britain and France, though sympathetic to the South's cotton trade, could no longer support a government built on slavery. The proclamation closed the door to foreign recognition of the Confederacy. Lincoln had not only redefined the war, he had reshaped world opinion. Perhaps the most profound impact was the opening of the Union Army to black soldiers. For generations, enslaved men had been denied the right to bear arms. Now, Lincoln's proclamation invited them to fight for their own freedom. By war's end, nearly 200,000 African-American soldiers and sailors would serve in the Union forces. Their courage, sacrifice, and determination would help turn the tide of the conflict. The most famous among them, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, whose bravery at Fort Wagner inspired the nation. The Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery overnight. That would require the 13th Amendment in 1865. But it changed the moral heart of the war. Every battle, every sacrifice, now carried a higher purpose. Union soldiers were not just fighting for the flag, they were fighting for freedom itself. Imagine being an enslaved man in Mississippi in 1863, hearing rumors that Lincoln had declared freedom. You had nothing but chains, and yet, suddenly, hope. Imagine being a Union soldier, weary from marching, now told that your struggle was not just for unity, but for justice. Would that new cause give you the strength to march further, to fight harder, to endure the unimaginable? The Emancipation Proclamation lit a fire across the land, but proclamations alone could not win the war. To truly cut the Confederacy in two, the Union had to capture the mighty fortress city of Vicksburg, the key to the Mississippi River. There, Ulysses S. Grant would face one of his greatest challenges and deliver one of the most decisive victories of the entire war. While Lincoln transformed the war with words, Ulysses S. Grant prepared to transform it with action. His target, the fortress city of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Perched high on bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River, Vicksburg was called the Gibraltar of the Confederacy. Whoever controlled it controlled the Mississippi. For the Confederacy, it was a lifeline, keeping Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana connected to the rest of the South. For the Union, it was the final key to splitting the Confederacy in two. If Grant could take Vicksburg, the Anaconda Plan would tighten to its deadliest grip. Grant's first attempts to capture Vicksburg were frustrating. The swamps and bayous around the city made movement nearly impossible. His soldiers slogged through mud, cut canals, and endured disease. Critics mocked him. Newspapers sneered that he was bogged down in Grant's ditch. But Grant was relentless. Unlike so many Union generals before him, he refused to retreat. He adapted, he improvised, and he struck when the enemy least expected it. In April 1863, Grant made his boldest move yet. He marched his army down the west bank of the Mississippi, then ferried them across the river south of Vicksburg. It was daring, cutting his own supply lines, plunging deep into enemy territory. But this was Grant's genius. Strike fast, live off the land, and never give the enemy time to recover. Over the next weeks, Grant's forces fought and won a series of battles: Port Gibson, Raymond, Jackson, Champion Hill. Each victory pushed the Confederates back, closing the noose tighter around Vicksburg. By May, Grant had Vicksburg surrounded. For 6 long weeks, Union artillery and gunboats pounded the city day and night. Food grew scarce. Civilians dug caves into the hillsides for shelter. People ate mules, dogs, even rats to survive. Inside the fortress, Confederate General John C. Pemberton held out stubbornly. But as July approached, the situation became desperate. His men were starving. Ammunition was running out. On July 4, 1863, Pemberton surrendered. The Union had taken Vicksburg. The Mississippi River was now under Union control, and the Confederacy was split in half. The victory at Vicksburg was monumental on its own, but fate had more in store. Just one day earlier, hundreds of miles away in Pennsylvania, the Union had scored another massive triumph at Gettysburg. In the span of 48 hours, the Confederacy suffered 2 devastating defeats. The tide of the war was turning. With Vicksburg, Ulysses S. Grant became a national hero. He had succeeded where others had failed, through determination, boldness, and a refusal to quit. Lincoln now saw in Grant the general he had been searching for all along. A man who didn't waste time with excuses. A man who fought. Imagine the celebration in the North that summer. Church bells rang, cannons fired in salute, crowds cheered in the streets. For the first time, people felt that maybe, just maybe, the Union could actually win this war. But in the South, despair deepened. With the Mississippi lost, the Confederacy was bleeding. Could they recover? Could Lee's army strike one more crushing blow in the East to offset the disaster in the West? As Grant carved his legend on the Mississippi, Robert E. Lee marched north with the Army of Northern Virginia. His gamble to strike another decisive blow, this time on Union soil. At a small Pennsylvania town called Gettysburg, the fate of the entire nation would hang in the balance. Summer 1863. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, under Robert E. Lee, was at its peak. Fresh off a stunning victory at Chancellorsville, Lee decided to gamble big. Instead of defending the South, he would invade the North. His hope, a decisive battle on Union soil that would force Lincoln to negotiate peace. A victory in the North might also sway Britain or France to recognize the Confederacy. Lee's target, a small crossroads town in Pennsylvania called Gettysburg. Lee's army moved north through the Shenandoah Valley, stealing supplies and filling wagons with food and livestock. Morale was high. For once, the war wasn't fought in the South's backyard, but Union cavalry under General John Buford spotted Lee's movements. On July 1, 1863, the two sides clashed unexpectedly near Gettysburg. What began as a skirmish would grow into the largest battle ever fought in North America. The Confederates pushed hard, and by the end of the first day, Union forces had fallen back to strong defensive positions on Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge. Lee believed he could finish the job quickly, but Union reinforcements were arriving. Among them was General George G. Meade, newly appointed commander of the Army of the Potomac. The stage was set for a brutal showdown. On the second day, Lee tried to outflank the Union. His attacks slammed into Union positions at Little Round Top, the wheat field, the peach orchard, and Devil's Den. The fighting was savage. Soldiers charged with bayonets, artillery roared, and the fields ran red with blood. One of the most dramatic moments came when Union Colonel Joshua Chamberlain and his 20th Maine Regiment defended the far left flank at Little Round Top. Running low on ammunition, Chamberlain ordered a desperate bayonet charge. Against all odds, they drove the Confederates back. Had they failed, the entire Union line might have collapsed. Lee's final gamble came on the third day. He ordered a massive assault directly at the Union center on Cemetery Ridge. 12,000 Confederate soldiers, led by General George Pickett, marched across open fields under withering Union artillery fire. Cannonballs tore through their ranks. Musket volleys shredded their lines. The Confederates pushed bravely forward, but the Union defenses held. When the smoke cleared, more than half of Pickett's men were dead or wounded. The assault was a disaster. Lee's army was forced to retreat. The Confederate invasion of the North had failed. Gettysburg was the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. Over 50,000 casualties in just 3 days. Farms, orchards, and fields became graveyards. The small town was left overwhelmed with the dead and dying. But the Union had won. For the first time, Lee's aura of invincibility was broken. The Confederacy would never again launch a major invasion of the North. Imagine being a soldier in those fields, hearing the thunder of cannon, seeing waves of men cut down before your eyes. 3 days of terror, of courage, of death. Gettysburg became a turning point, not the end of the war, but the moment when hope shifted. The South could still fight, but victory, that dream was slipping away. In November of that same year, President Abraham Lincoln visited Gettysburg to dedicate a cemetery. His words, just 272 of them, would go down in history as the Gettysburg Address. He reminded the nation that the war was not only about preserving the Union, but about testing whether freedom and democracy could endure. Government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. With those words, Lincoln gave new meaning to the sacrifice made on those fields. Gettysburg was a turning point, but the war was far from over. Battles still raged across the South, and new horrors awaited. Meanwhile, Ulysses S. Grant, fresh off his triumph at Vicksburg, was about to take command of the entire Union Army. And his strategy would be brutal, strike everywhere, all at once until the Confederacy could no longer stand. The war was entering a darker, bloodier phase. By early 1864, the Civil War had raged for nearly 3 years. The Union had seen victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, yet the Confederacy still fought with a ferocity that refused to break. Lincoln knew the war could not drag on forever. He needed a general who would fight with relentless determination, a man who would not retreat, would not hesitate, and would not stop until the Union was restored. That man was Ulysses S. Grant. Grant had built his reputation in the West with victories at Fort Donelson, Shiloh, and Vicksburg. He was not flashy. He was not a political schemer like some of his rivals. He was quiet, often rumpled, sometimes accused of drinking too much. But Grant had something the others lacked: results. Lincoln promoted him to lieutenant general, a rank not held since George Washington. Grant now commanded all Union armies. The mission was clear: bring the war to a decisive end. Grant understood the Confederacy's strength lay not only in its armies, but also in its ability to keep moving, to survive battle after battle. To win, Grant would not simply chase Lee or defend territory, he would apply pressure everywhere at once. The Union would launch simultaneous offensives across multiple fronts. Sherman would march through Georgia, Banks would move into Louisiana, Meade and Grant would strike directly at Lee in Virginia. This was total war, not just against Confederate armies, but against their ability to wage war at all. In May 1864, Grant and Lee faced off in Virginia. What followed was a brutal series of battles known as the Overland Campaign. The first clash came in the tangled thickets of the wilderness. Flames from musket fire set the dry brush ablaze. Wounded soldiers burned alive where they lay. The fighting was savage and chaotic, but Grant did something no Union general before him had done. He didn't retreat. After days of carnage, instead of turning back, Grant ordered his men to march south toward Richmond. His soldiers cheered. They knew they had a leader who would keep pressing forward. Next came Spotsylvania Courthouse, a 2-week bloodbath of trench warfare, with men fighting hand-to-hand in rain-soaked earthworks. One section, later called the Bloody Angle, saw 20 hours of non-stop combat. Still, Grant pressed on. By June, the armies met at Cold Harbor. Here, Union soldiers launched a frontal assault against entrenched Confederate lines. Thousands were cut down in minutes. It was a mistake Grant later admitted he regretted, yet he refused to quit. His famous words summed it up: "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." Realizing a direct strike on Richmond would be too costly, Grant turned to the rail hub of Petersburg. If Petersburg fell, Richmond, the Confederate capital, would be cut off. The result was nearly 10 months of trench warfare, eerily foreshadowing the horrors of World War I. Soldiers lived in mud, endured constant shelling, and fought deadly raids across no man's land. Grant's war of attrition was grinding Lee down. The Confederates were bleeding men and supplies they could not replace. But here's the haunting truth. For every Confederate soldier lost, nearly 2 Union soldiers fell. Grant's strategy was costly, and many in the North called him a butcher. And yet, his plan was working. Lee's army was shrinking. The South was gasping for air. Meanwhile, far to the south, another Union general was preparing a campaign that would shock the world and break the Confederacy's heart. As Grant pinned down Lee in Virginia, General William Tecumseh Sherman prepared his march through Georgia. His goal, not just to defeat Confederate armies, but to shatter the South's will to fight. Sherman's campaign would leave a scar on the land and on the memory of the war that still burns in American history. While Grant hammered Lee in Virginia, another general was striking at the very heart of the Confederacy. His name was William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman had fought alongside Grant in the West, earning a reputation for both brilliance and ruthlessness. Where Grant believed in relentless attack, Sherman believed in something even harsher, destroying not only enemy armies, but the very ability of the South to sustain war. This was total war. In the spring of 1864, Sherman began his march into Georgia with more than 100,000 Union soldiers. His target, the vital city of Atlanta, the Confederacy's railroad hub and industrial powerhouse. The campaign was a brutal chess match against Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston, who skillfully delayed Sherman's advance with defensive tactics. But Sherman was just as relentless as Grant. Day by day, battle by battle, he edged closer to Atlanta. By September 1864, after fierce fighting and heavy losses, Sherman's forces captured the city. The fall of Atlanta sent shockwaves through the South and electrified the North. It came just in time for Abraham Lincoln's re-election campaign. Many had doubted Lincoln could win another term, but Sherman's victory revived faith that the Union could actually end the war. But Sherman was not finished. Instead of simply holding Atlanta, he made a daring and controversial decision. Cut his supply lines and march his army 300 miles to the Atlantic coast, living off the land and destroying everything of military value along the way. His goal was clear: break the South spirit. In November 1864, Sherman's army set out from Atlanta. Behind them, the city burned. Ahead lay Georgia's countryside, plantations, railroads, warehouses, and farms. Union soldiers tore up railroad tracks, twisting the iron rails into shapes they mockingly called Sherman's neckties. They seized livestock, burned barns, and destroyed crops. They left a scar of devastation 50 miles wide across the state. Sherman's march was not just about defeating Confederate armies. It was about breaking the backbone of Southern resistance. By December, Sherman reached Savannah, Georgia, capturing the port city without a fight. He famously sent a telegram to President Lincoln, offering Savannah as a Christmas gift. It was more than just a military victory. It was psychological warfare, a message to the South. Resistance was futile. For civilians, Sherman's march was a nightmare. Families saw their homes burned, their food seized, their livelihoods destroyed. Many Southern civilians came to despise Sherman as the embodiment of Union cruelty. And yet, Sherman believed this destruction would shorten the war, saving lives in the long run by forcing the Confederacy to surrender sooner. Imagine being a farmer in Georgia, watching blue-coated soldiers pour across your land, your fences toppled, your barn in flames. Imagine the terror and the hopelessness of realizing the war was now on your doorstep. Sherman's march to the sea remains one of the most controversial campaigns in American history. Was it necessary? Was it cruel? Or was it the brutal reality of a war that had already taken so much? By early 1865, Sherman turned his army north into the Carolinas, while Grant tightened his grip on Lee in Virginia. The Confederacy was being squeezed from every side. In Richmond, Jefferson Davis and his cabinet clung desperately to hope, but even Robert E. Lee could see the truth. The end was drawing near. The last battles of the Civil War would soon unfold, and with them, the fall of the Confederate capital itself. By the spring of 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. Its armies were battered, its railroads shattered, its cities in ruins. The once proud dream of independence was crumbling under the weight of Union steel and fire. At the heart of it all lay Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital. For 4 long years, it had stood as the symbol of Southern defiance. Now, it was the last prize. If Richmond fell, the Confederacy itself would fall with it. For months, Grant had pressed Lee's army against the trenches of Petersburg, the lifeline to Richmond. Supplies dwindled. Confederate soldiers deserted in growing numbers, some barefoot, starving, desperate. Lee's men were still fierce, still dangerous, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Every week, Union artillery chewed away more of their defenses. The noose was tightening. On April 2, 1865, after nearly 10 months of siege, Grant ordered a massive assault on Petersburg. Union troops stormed the Confederate lines in waves. The defenses broke. That night, Lee informed Confederate President Jefferson Davis that Richmond could no longer be held. Davis and his cabinet fled the city by train, carrying what remained of the Confederate government into the night. Richmond, the beating heart of the Confederacy, was abandoned. As Confederate forces retreated, fires broke out across the city. Warehouses, bridges, and munitions stores were torched to keep them from Union hands. But the flames spread wildly. By the time Union soldiers marched in the next morning, much of Richmond was in ruins. Its streets filled with smoke, its people dazed and broken. Union troops raised the stars and stripes over the city. Richmond, once the proud capital of rebellion, now belonged to the Union. Just 2 days later, Abraham Lincoln himself entered the fallen city. Without guards, without fanfare, he walked through the streets as newly freed African Americans flocked to him, kneeling in gratitude and awe. Lincoln gently told them, "You must kneel to God only and thank Him for your freedom." It was a moment heavy with history. The war was not yet over, but the Confederacy's fate was sealed. Robert E. Lee's army, now cut off and dwindling, retreated westward. His men marched hungry, ragged, pursued relentlessly by Grant's forces. Lee's plan was to reach supplies farther south and link with other Confederate forces. But Grant was always one step ahead, blocking his path at every turn. The chase was nearly done. Picture it, weary Confederate soldiers trudging through mud, their uniforms in tatters, their stomachs empty. Each day, they lost more comrades, captured or killed. Each night, the Union Army loomed closer like a storm they could not escape. How long could they run? How long could they fight? The Confederacy's last hope now rested on Lee's decision. Would he surrender, or would he fight to the bitter end, unleashing one final bloodbath? On April 9, 1865, in a quiet Virginia town called Appomattox Courthouse, the Civil War would reach its dramatic conclusion. There, Robert E. to Lee and Ulysses S. Grant would meet face to face, and in that meeting, the fate of the United States would be sealed. April 1865. The Army of Northern Virginia was in retreat. Once the pride of the Confederacy, Robert E. Lee's men were now starving, ragged, and outnumbered. For days, Union forces had cut off every escape route. Supplies were gone, ammunition was scarce. The Confederate dream was slipping away. The chase ended in a quiet Virginia village called Appomattox Courthouse. On April 9th, General Lee sat with his officers. He knew the truth. His men could no longer fight. To continue would mean senseless slaughter. With dignity heavy on his shoulders, Lee made the hardest choice of his life. He would surrender. He sent word to Ulysses S. Grant, requesting a meeting. That afternoon, in the home of Wilmer McLean, a man whose farm had once been the site of the war's first major battle at Bull Run, Lee and Grant met face to face. The contrast was striking. Lee in his finest uniform, immaculate, with polished boots and sword at his side. Grant in a simple mud-stained uniform without even a sword, looking more like a common soldier than the Union's commanding general. But appearances mattered little. The weight of history filled the room. Grant's terms were generous, astonishingly so. Confederate soldiers would lay down their arms but could return home, free to keep their horses and personal belongings. Officers could keep their sidearms. For men who had fought so long and so hard, it was an unexpected mercy. Lee, silent but grateful, accepted. The Civil War, America's bloodiest conflict, was effectively over. When word spread, Union soldiers erupted in celebration. They fired their muskets into the air, cheered, and shouted in triumph. But Grant quickly ordered them to stop. This was not a time for gloating, he told them. The men they had fought were now their countrymen again. For Confederate soldiers, the moment was filled with sorrow. They stacked their weapons in silence, tears on their faces, saluting one last time before turning toward home. With Lee's surrender, the backbone of the Confederacy was broken. Other Southern armies soon followed, laying down their arms. In just 4 years, the war had claimed more than 600,000 lives, a toll greater than any war in American history up to that time. The Union had been preserved. Slavery, the institution that had driven the nation apart, was crumbling. But the scars left by the conflict would remain for generations. Imagine standing in that room with Lee and Grant, two men who had fought a brutal, unforgiving war, now face to face in silence. Imagine the relief, the sorrow, the strange calm after 4 years of fire and blood. This was not just the end of a war, it was the beginning of a new, uncertain chapter for America. The guns had fallen silent, but the nation's wounds ran deep. Over the next years, America would face the challenge of Reconstruction, to heal a broken country, to rebuild lives, and to decide what freedom would truly mean. And for Abraham Lincoln, the president who had guided the Union through its darkest hours, a new battle awaited, not on the battlefield, but in the shadows of Washington itself. April 1865. The Civil War was ending. The Union had been preserved. The Confederacy lay in ruins. And for the first time in 4 long years, Americans began to dream of peace. At the heart of it all was Abraham Lincoln. The man who had guided the nation through its darkest hour now stood on the edge of triumph. But fate would not allow him to see the peace he had fought for. On April 9th, when Lee surrendered at Appomattox, Washington erupted with joy. Crowds filled the streets, bands played patriotic songs, and fireworks lit the skies. Lincoln addressed the nation from the White House balcony. His words were hopeful, but also clear. Reconstruction would not be about revenge, but about rebuilding. He spoke of extending rights to formerly enslaved people. He spoke of healing. In the crowd that night was a young actor, a Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth. When Booth heard Lincoln speak of black citizenship, he snarled to a friend, "That means N, your citizenship." That is the last speech he will ever make. Booth had made his decision. John Wilkes Booth was famous, a celebrated actor adored by theater audiences, but he was also consumed by rage over the Confederacy's defeat. He formed a plot with several accomplices, not just to kill Lincoln, but to decapitate the Union government in one swift blow. They planned to assassinate Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward on the same night. Booth would take Lincoln. Good Friday. Lincoln and his wife, Mary Todd, accepted an invitation to attend a play at Ford's Theater, a comedy called Our American Cousin. They arrived to cheers. The audience rose in applause as the President and First Lady took their seats in the presidential box. For the first time in years, Lincoln smiled freely. The war was over. But Booth was already inside. He knew the play, knew exactly when the audience would laugh loudest. That would be his moment. At 10:15 p.m., as the theater roared with laughter, Booth slipped into the president's box. He raised a pistol, a small Derringer, and fired one shot into the back of Lincoln's head. The president slumped forward. Mary Todd screamed. Booth leapt onto the stage, brandishing a dagger. As he landed awkwardly, he shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants. He fled into the night. Lincoln was carried across the street to a boarding house. Doctors worked desperately, but the wound was mortal. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln breathed his last. The man who had saved the Union, who had given freedom to millions, was gone. News spread like wildfire. People wept openly in the streets. Flags were draped in black. The nation plunged into mourning. Meanwhile, Booth was on the run. For 12 days, he hid in swamps, barns, and backwoods, believing he would be hailed as a hero. Instead, he was hunted like an animal. On April 26th, the Union soldiers cornered him in a Virginia barn. When he refused to surrender, the barn was set ablaze. Booth was shot and killed. His dream of glory died with him. Lincoln's death was more than a personal tragedy, it was a national catastrophe. His vision for a compassionate Reconstruction died with him. In his place came harsher politics, deeper divisions, and struggles that would scar America for generations. Yet Lincoln's legacy endured. The Gettysburg Address, the Emancipation Proclamation, and his very sacrifice made him a symbol, not just of Union victory, but of the nation's enduring promise. Imagine being in that theater, the joy of peace still in the air, when suddenly a single gunshot shatters everything. Imagine the silence, the disbelief, the grief that swept across a war-torn nation. Lincoln lived to see victory, but not to guide the peace that followed. The war was over, the president was dead, and America stood at a crossroads. The question now was this: could the United States heal after 4 years of bloodshed? Could freedom and equality truly be realized in the years to come? The answer lay in the turbulent era of Reconstruction, an era of hope, betrayal, violence, and change. April 1865. The Civil War had ended. The Confederacy was no more. 4 million enslaved men, women, and children had gained their freedom. But the question that haunted America was simple: what now? How do you heal a nation ripped apart by war, hatred, and slavery? Lincoln's assassination shocked the world. In every city, black drapes covered buildings, soldiers marched in solemn processions, and Americans, North and South, struggled to imagine the future without him. For the freedmen, there was hope. For ex-Confederates, there was bitterness. For politicians, there was opportunity and danger. Without Lincoln's steady hand, leadership fell to his vice president, Andrew Johnson. Johnson was a Southerner from Tennessee who had remained loyal to the Union, but he was no friend to the freed slaves. He despised the wealthy planters of the South, but he also believed in white supremacy. His plan for Reconstruction was lenient, too lenient. He quickly allowed Southern states to re-enter the Union with minimal punishment. Former Confederate leaders regained power almost overnight. And while freedmen dreamed of land, education, and equality, the South unleashed something else: black codes. In state after state, laws were passed to strip away the freedom just won. African Americans were forbidden from owning guns. They could not serve on juries. They were forced into exploitative labor contracts that looked a lot like slavery under a new name. If they refused, they could be arrested for vagrancy and sentenced to forced labor. Freedom was promised, but in practice, it was already slipping away. Many in Congress, especially the radical Republicans, were outraged. They saw Johnson's leniency as betrayal. Men like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner demanded harsh measures against the South and full rights for freedmen. In 1866, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, guaranteeing citizenship and equal protection under the law. Johnson vetoed it. Congress overrode him. That same year, they proposed the 14th Amendment, enshrining equal citizenship in the Constitution itself. It was a clash of visions: Johnson's weak Reconstruction versus Congress's radical attempt to rebuild America on new principles of justice. One of the most important institutions of this era was the Freedmen's Bureau. It built schools, provided food and clothing, helped negotiate labor contracts, and sought to protect the rights of the newly freed. For the first time in American history, large numbers of African Americans learned to read and write. Education became a weapon of freedom, but the Bureau was underfunded, attacked by white Southerners, and sabotaged by Johnson. Still, its impact was undeniable. Yet in the South, another force was rising. Former Confederates, unwilling to accept defeat, turned to terror. The Ku Klux Klan was born, an invisible empire of night riders who wore white hoods and burned crosses. They used violence and intimidation to suppress black voters, assassinate leaders, and restore white supremacy. Reconstruction would not be a peaceful process. It would be a new kind of war. Despite the violence, progress was real. For the first time in American history, black men voted and held office. Hiram Revels became the first black U.S. Senator. State legislatures across the South included freedmen working alongside white allies. The dream of a multiracial democracy flickered to life, but it was fragile, constantly under attack. By 1867, Congress had had enough of Johnson. They passed the Reconstruction Acts, placing the South under military occupation until fair governments were established. Johnson tried to resist. He clashed with Congress at every turn. Finally, in 1868, the House of Representatives impeached him. Johnson barely survived removal by a single vote in the Senate. His presidency was ruined. Amid this political chaos, progress continued. In 1870, the 15th Amendment was ratified, guaranteeing black men the right to vote. It was a monumental step, but also one that unleashed a wave of backlash across the South. Imagine being a freedman in 1867, voting for the first time. Imagine stepping into a polling place where your father and grandfather had been enslaved. Imagine marking your ballot while armed white men glared at you, threatening your life if you dared exercise your right. The courage it took was unimaginable. The Civil War was over, but Reconstruction revealed a new truth. Winning the war had been easier than winning the peace. Progress was real, but so was the resistance. The struggle for equality had only just begun. The next chapter of America's story would be one of betrayal, compromise, and the slow unraveling of Reconstruction. Reconstruction had raised hopes of a new America, an America rebuilt on freedom, equality, and unity. But by the 1870s, those dreams were slipping away. White resistance grew stronger. Political will in the North began to fade. And soon, the fragile experiment in multiracial democracy collapsed. This was not just political defeat. It was betrayal. The Civil War had drained the North of blood and treasure. For years after, Northerners tolerated the cost of Reconstruction, troops stationed in the South, money spent on rebuilding, and constant political battles. But as the years passed, many in the North grew tired. They wanted to move on. They wanted railroads, industry, and economic growth, not endless conflict over the South. The plight of freedmen faded from national concern. Meanwhile, white Southerners regrouped. They called themselves redeemers, men who vowed to redeem the South from black political power and Northern interference. Using intimidation, fraud, and violence, they worked to drive black voters from the polls. The Ku Klux Klan and other paramilitary groups became the shock troops of redemption. Night after night, they terrorized communities, burning homes, lynching leaders, and spreading fear. Slowly, state by state, Reconstruction governments fell. Then came economic disaster. In 1873, the U.S. was hit by a financial panic that plunged the nation into depression. Banks collapsed, railroads failed, and unemployment soared. Suddenly, Americans cared more about putting food on the table than protecting freedmen's rights. Reconstruction was losing its strongest allies, the people's attention, and the government's resources. Even the courts turned against progress. In a series of decisions, the Supreme Court gutted Reconstruction laws. The Slaughterhouse Cases, 1873, narrowed the meaning of the 14th Amendment, limiting federal protection of civil rights. U.S. v. Cruikshank, 1876, stripped the government of power to prosecute individuals for racial violence, even massacres. The message was clear: the federal government would not protect black citizens from terror. By 1876, Reconstruction hung by a thread. The presidential election that year would decide its fate. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes faced Democrat Samuel J. Tilden. The results were chaos, disputed votes in multiple southern states. For months, the nation teetered on the edge of crisis. Finally, a deal was struck: the Compromise of 1877. Hayes would become president, but in exchange, federal troops would be withdrawn from the South. It was the death sentence for Reconstruction. With the soldiers gone, Southern white Democrats reclaimed control completely. They moved swiftly to roll back progress. Schools for freedmen closed. Voting rights were crushed through poll taxes, literacy tests, and violence. By the 1890s, the South had entered a new dark age of segregation, Jim Crow. The dream of Reconstruction was buried under the weight of racism and betrayal, and yet something survived. Though Reconstruction collapsed, it left behind amendments that could not be erased. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment guaranteed citizenship and equal protection. The 15th Amendment promised the right to vote. For decades, these promises would be ignored, but one day they would become the foundation of a new movement, the civil rights movement of the 20th century. The seeds of freedom had been planted, even if it would take nearly a century for them to bloom. Imagine being a freedman in 1877. You had tasted freedom, you had voted, you had seen men of your own race serve in Congress, and now, piece by piece, it was stripped away. The dream slipped through your fingers. Would you despair? Or would you hold on to hope for the day your children or your grandchildren might rise again? Reconstruction had ended not with triumph, but with betrayal. But the legacy of the Civil War did not end there. The United States was forever changed, its scars deep, its battles unfinished. In the next chapter, we step back to look at the war's larger impact. How did it transform America's economy, society, and culture? And how did the Civil War set the stage for the America we know today? The Civil War ended in 1865, but in truth, its echoes never stopped. More than 620,000 Americans were dead. Brothers, fathers, and sons lost on both sides. Entire cities lay in ruins. Plantations were ashes. Railroads twisted and burned. And yet, out of this destruction came transformation. The Civil War reshaped America, its politics, its economy, its society, and its very identity. The war's toll was staggering. In nearly every town, cemeteries filled with young men who had never returned. Mothers mourned sons. Wives grieved husbands. Children grew up without fathers. In the South, women carried the burden of survival. Fields had to be tended, families fed, and lives rebuilt without the enslaved labor that once propped up the system. The war touched everyone. No community was left untouched. The greatest legacy of the Civil War was the end of slavery. 4 million men, women, and children were freed. Families torn apart by the auction block searched desperately for one another. Churches, schools, and communities blossomed as freedmen built new lives. Though true equality was denied for generations, emancipation was an irreversible victory. America could no longer call itself the land of the free while holding millions in chains. Before the war, people said the United States are. After the war, they said the United States is. The Civil War forged a stronger central government. The supremacy of the Union was no longer a question. States' rights had limits. The nation was indivisible. Economically, the war accelerated industrialization. The North surged ahead with factories, railroads, and new technologies, setting the stage for America's rise as a global power. The South, devastated and impoverished, would lag behind for generations. When the soldiers came home, they brought with them scars, physical and emotional. Amputees filled hospitals. Trauma haunted minds. But veterans also carried stories. Campfires, diaries, and reunions kept the memory of the war alive. Both North and South built monuments to their fallen, shaping how future generations remembered the conflict. Reconstruction had ended in failure, but its ideals lingered. The promises of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments remained in the Constitution, waiting to be redeemed. It would take nearly 100 years and the courage of another generation for those promises to be fulfilled in the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil War had opened the door to freedom. It was up to future Americans to walk through it. The Civil War became a defining story in American culture. From battlefield reenactments to novels like Gone with the Wind, from Lincoln's speeches to haunting songs like Battle Hymn of the Republic, the war embedded itself into America's soul. It was not just history, it was memory, it was identity. The world watched the Civil War closely. Monarchs and revolutionaries alike studied its outcome. The Union's victory proved that democracy could survive even the gravest of tests. It showed that a republic divided by war could emerge stronger. It set America on the path to becoming a global leader in the 20th century. But here's the question we must ask ourselves today. Did the Civil War truly end? The cannons fell silent. Yes, the armies disbanded. But the struggle over freedom, equality, and unity continues. The battles fought on the fields of Gettysburg, Antietam, and Appomattox still echo in the fights for justice and equality today. The Civil War was the deadliest conflict in American history. It was a war of ideas, freedom against slavery, unity against disunion, progress against the past. It left scars that never fully healed, but it also gave birth to a stronger, freer nation. This was not just brother against brother. This was the war that defined America. And as we close this journey on Mission America, we ask you, what lessons will we carry from this history? If you've been with us from the start to this final moment, thank you for taking this journey. Subscribe to Mission America to keep exploring the stories that shaped this nation. Because history is not just the past, it is the key to our future.